Okay, hi everyone. My name is Sophie Sparks, and I'm the host today of this great webinar with decision making, reporting, dashboarding, and beyond with Louisa O'Brien and Chris Love. So, thank you all for joining today. If you don't know Louisa and Chris, I will tell you a little bit about them. Louisa is one of our consultants here at the Information Lab, and Chris Love and Louisa recently joined our team from the Data School. So, she has been skilled up in all things data for the last few years, and it's absolutely fantastic to have her join us on the core team. And Chris Love is a Tableau Zen Hall of Fame master. You may have known him, may have heard of him before, and he's wearing a Zen Master t-shirt, if you can see there in his video, if you had any doubts over his total Zen status. Here at the Information Lab, we are Tableau and Alteryx and AWS and Snowflake partner. So we are all things data all the time, it seems. And if you have any questions for Chris or Louisa, can you please type them into the chat box or the Q&A box, and they will answer them at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions around when the recording will be sent out of this webinar, I'll answer those if you type them into the chat box or the Q&A box. So without wasting any more of anyone's time, Chris and Louisa, can you please take over?
Cool. Thank you very much for that introduction, Sophie. Very comprehensive. I definitely know I would have missed some of that out if I'd have done it myself. So good afternoon from the UK, everyone. Today we'll be discussing decision-making, reporting, dashboarding, and beyond, and specifically using personas to choose the right platform for your requirements. So just briefly, the agenda for today is we'll be discussing what is decision-making with data, what are the usual approaches, and what are some of the advantages and pitfalls, what is persona analysis, how can persona analysis help us, and then lastly, an applied example. So let's start with decision-making with data. I often find it easiest to define with what it's not. It's not a hunch, it's not an anecdote, and it's not deferring the decision to the person with the biggest hat in the room, or alternatively, the biggest stick. Decision-making with data is important for organizations because they need to make decisions consistently, and it's not actually the organization, this kind of virtual construct that makes the decision, it's the people inside them. But Chris, how would you define decision-making with data?
I think I tend to define it like you, by a slightly different realm of talking about who is decision making with data. So when we talk about decision making with data, what we're really describing is getting data into the hands of the people who are making decisions, and that's not just focusing on a narrow view of people who are perhaps creating dashboards who've got access to tools or middle management. It's looking in a very wide view at who might need that data and why they might need it.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure you're all thinking, well, isn't that what we all do? And isn't, what else are dashboards for? So you might think that decision-making with data is the driving force behind our current aim towards being data-led companies, very trendy topic at the moment, which has spawned thousands of articles, conference talks, tweets, PR statements. But there still seems to be a huge gap between organizations recognizing the power and value of their data and actually using it to make decisions. And this could be down to a variety of reasons, such as the data is there, but it's not actually accessible. It might be confined to the products which have gathered it, for example, or outsourced. The data is there, but it's siloed, which is very, very common in that each department knows their own data, but they don't work in a cross-functional way. And one of the key drivers of any we must be better with data decisions in an organization tends to be we should work together. The data might be available, but it's not at the right level of aggregation. So it could be too granular for executives or too general for operations. I've got two more. The data is available, but it's not in a way that is accessible to users, such as staff who are on the go, like salespeople, or decision makers without fixed desks, like factory or warehouse managers, and other people who work in production or manufacturing and stuff like that. And lastly, the data is available and accessible, but not presented in a way that makes sense to users. And I don't have time to fiddle with the dashboard to work it out. I love a dashboard as much as the next person, but the way that I often or sometimes the way that we build dashboards is we want to build in loads of features into them, because we then create something that's, you know, really cool and versatile and really flexible. But then actually, how easy is it to get to your decision when you have to change all these settings? So considering all these obstacles, is it any wonder that the path to being data-driven is a bit bumpier than it seems? So Chris, can you give us some examples, because obviously with your extensive client experience, of the obstacles that organizations face on the path to using data to make decisions?
Yeah, I think there's often a conception that you build it and they will come. And so what we often do is put lots of effort into building dashboards that we roll out and then kind of put our feet up. We're happy. We feel we've done all the work. But actually, what's happened is that the data, as I said earlier, you know, the data isn't going into the hands of those people who are decision making. Not everyone is going to be a dashboard user, and therefore they feel very cut off from that decision making process, and often decisions are passed down to them that are made with data, and they don't get to see the end results. So those kind of, it comes down to communication, it comes down to using the right tools, and I guess that's what we're going to be going through as we talk about ways to combat that in the next 50 minutes or so.
Yeah, indeed. And on that subject, so partly related to communication, often when we see this in conferences and that kind of thing, the data literacy topic comes up very closely. So do you think data literacy is the answer here, that we just need to tell people about charts more?
I think data literacy plays a big part, but data literacy certainly isn't just helping to explain to people how to read a chart and how to understand it. Data literacy comes all the way back to explaining to people why they need to ingest data in the first place, what data plays a role in what they do already, why they should engage with it, and why they should perhaps fill in forms properly, help build out data sets in their day-to-day role. Giving people an understanding of that full data picture is a big part of data literacy. So yeah, I think sometimes data literacy gets a little bit lost in terms of as we describe it.
Cool. So yeah, so what we'll be discussing today is partly around these subjects, and often we'll be approaching it from the perspective of enablement and rollout. So even if you already have a solution available, you'll probably still be requiring to enable your staff and rolling out different tools and solutions. So even if you're not at the start of your data journey, hopefully today will be really valuable to you. So how do we usually approach enablement? So we've gone through the roadmap, set up the infrastructure, bought the licenses, dished out some training, and yet the organization isn't moving forwards. What's gone wrong? So Chris, if you were approached with this at a client, how might you advise them? Where would you start? We've done everything, but for some reason, it's not quite working.
I think the key where things typically go wrong is that as I mentioned earlier, there's been this focus very much on building out a set of dashboards with a very narrow view of if we build a set of dashboards, then everything will work. So what we're typically trying to do if things do go wrong, and obviously that hopefully we'll be involved in the process so that they don't go wrong. But yeah, helping to dig right down into actually who needs that data, what decisions need to be made so that people feel engaged with the dashboards or the data that they're getting fed. That engagement is a key part of building things out and finding where things go wrong, because typically things will go wrong with a piece of data enablement or a data dashboard rollout or a BI system rollout. The first point it's obvious is that people aren't using the dashboards that they've been built. That's often because they've been spec'd up front. They've been built to a set of requirements, and the communication hasn't been there with the end users, and they're not involved.
Yeah, so a lot of the challenge you just spoke about is we often see in clients who are adopting quite a formal process about their enablement or their rollout. So they're slow, but they're valuable in their own way because they are much clearer, they take time, and they're very stable for organizations. The alternative, which is often one we advise at the Information Lab, is an organic growth approach, where we gradually accumulate passionate users and spread to different departments. So this puts power in the hands of the analysts. And of course, everybody loves passion. It's great to work with passionate people, but often it's not as organized as that more formal process. So often with that formal process, we've taken the requirements and we've synthesized them across the organization into an average Jane, a single figure who doesn't really exist, through which we evaluate potential solutions. So when when I say that, it might seem natural to go, oh yeah, so we should do the organic version, right? The issue with the organic approach is that it can encourage a this works for me attitude amongst our passionate staff who are experts in their day jobs, but not at deploying software or change management, which means that users who might gain a lot of value, but don't necessarily have a lot of time with the solution, can be left behind, and they would create bumps in our enablement. So the way that we can view these two different approaches is kind of pulling away from each other. Although their methods are in opposition, they sometimes aren't as different as they might like to seem. So if we just consider these among some aspects of our what's important with rollout, which I'm just going to show on the screen, we'll just consider how these are different, but also sometimes how they're similar. So formal approaches try to control budget and have organized project plans, which are a good thing. However, implementing technology when that technology is changing very fast is hard. The organic approach tries to avoid getting bogged down in that planning, therefore, and is mostly pretty successful with it because it's relying on people to keep up with the product themselves. But sometimes a lack of planning can also mean a lack of governance, which, depending on the risk tolerance of the organization, might be very unpalatable. So Chris, if you were talking to a client about this and they were sort of wondering which way to go in terms of their budget and project planning for their enablement or for their rollout, whether for an entire platform or just for a new analytics solution, is there any particular advice that you'd give them?
I think a lot depends on culture and maturity of where that organization is. I think it's really hard to say we should just do this or do that. So often what we're exploring is how wide do they want to roll things out? How formal do they need to be? Is this a wider, more strategic implementation right from the off, or are we really helping just a handful of users really get the most of it in kind of a POC? And what we often see is that things will start off very organically and move more over to the left-hand side of a more formal approach as things go. I think it's very rare that we would typically advise a full, very formal rollout that doesn't have aspects of that organic growth. I think it's very possible to combine the two as well. I guess what you're talking, when we talk about the different pieces, we're talking about the where it's possible to go at one extreme or the other. And there's obviously a range in between as well.
Yeah, one thing that's really good about the organic growth approach is that it kind of creates an implicit evaluation of the product as we use it, because it's only going to grow if people like it and actually like using it. So we can all appreciate it's a very practical and straightforward method of evaluation and isn't, some big tick list of requirements or a number on a chart that says it's fulfilled its return on investment by this year or something like that. But one of the issues with our organic growth is that our recommendations in our business tend to be passed on by word of mouth, and that we tend to talk to people who are, or make recommendations to people who have similar roles, abilities, and preferences to us, which does limit our ability to evaluate the product across the business or across a range of users, depending on what we've built. So on the other hand, I can also see why a formal approach can be very helpful, or aspects of it can be very helpful, because it's trying to pick up that across all the different organizations to make sure that nobody's left out. But at the same time, even within our single company, while both of these approaches are reflective of company culture, we should also bear in mind that different departments and sections, even within a single organization, have their own cultures. And what probably works for some departments, and indeed some people within those departments, probably won't work for others. So both of these approaches, or the way that we've sort of structured our argument here, can kind of flatten our organizations into a bit of a binary, which is easy for people to understand. You know, trying to make something for everyone is hard. It's going to be really hard to try and do a plan that works for everyone, or relying on sort of DIY and organic growth means that you'll get the people who are good at DIY. One last thing I would add is that one of the other benefits of a formal rollout approach, and full hands up, I used to work in the public sector, I'm really used to formal rollout approaches and stuff like that, is it reminds me of the quote, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. We probably won't completely stick to the plan, but with the plan we've got, we've given some idea of our strategy and how we can progress moving forwards. But what if your business is just starting your data journey? So it's probably too early for something as grand as strategy. You know, if you're a small company and people start talking about data strategies, you might laugh them out of the room. But organic growth, as we grow as businesses, means that we can often outgrow our informal network of passionate users, because we don't want to stress them out by making them do their day job and also be the support network for their program. So that sometimes means we can end up spending a lot of time firefighting instead of preempting issues. So here, a little bit of thought goes a long way. So Chris, how often do you see it where organizations have started with that organic approach, and, you know, do they realize they're in the firefighting stage? You know, are they planning well in advance and avoiding it, or is it often it's like, oh no, wait, here I am, and wait, we need to think about this?
Yeah, I think very, very quickly, the organic approach, it works really well for vendors, because, you know, we're often lighting lots and lots of fires across an organization. People will naturally get excited as you roll out a product like Tableau or Ultrex, and they'll see the benefits of that tool very quickly. Word of mouth will spread, and it's very easy to see things snowball and people to really get used to stop building out things and spend a lot of time doing that. And I think it's one of the challenges that we face when managing a rollout like that, is that it's bringing things back to the actual business value rather than playing with these tools and really enjoying yourself building out a set of dashboards.
Yeah.
Bringing people back and focusing on, well, what actually are you going to do with this that is going to change your day job, and change decision making and bring it back to that strategic objective. Really gets left behind sometimes. So it's really important to try and focus on that and rein people in a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, and often, you know, I've seen it at clients as well, where you don't want to be the person pouring the water on the fire.
Yeah.
So you need to find a fine balance, and this is essentially what this webinar is about, where an approach we've recently taken with some of our clients tries to navigate this balance. So essentially, this just on this slide, we can see we've got our sort of exaggerated formality versus organic approaches, and some summaries of their positives and minuses. And that a formal rollout approach can, but not always, tends towards a single solution, because it's easier, isn't it? We have something that works for everyone. You know, it works for everyone. That's great. Whereas with our organic approach, it kind of creates that survival of the fittest between the different tools. So, well, the one that wins out must be the one that everybody likes, or possibly one or two. So what we've done is we've brought in persona analysis as a midway. It's a technique borrowed from agile methodology to ensure that developers are building products which are actually useful for their end users, without necessarily having to endlessly focus group them. It gives you some idea of the variety of requirements of an organization, but it doesn't force decisions about scale, and it doesn't force particular departments to pick, you know, certain things that they want to prioritize first. And then, you know, that's when you get you end up with departments using all different tools, and then you have this awkward meeting in 6 months where you have to pick one. Lastly, while analysts definitely have input into the product with persona analysis, because of course they do, neither they nor the executives paying for it, the people with the biggest stick or the people with the biggest hat, are the only envisioned end users. So just before we get into this, let's just take a quick sidestep into looking exactly what we've borrowed from Agile. So a persona is a sketch of a user from a product based on known and validated information from the populations they present. By giving the product developers, buyers, enablers, analysts, and the like a human face, or often actually a name, to think about, it grounds our evaluation of the requirements or what we need and our analysis of the gaps in our solution in a way that the formal process might be a bit too robotic about, but the organic process might be a little bit too disorganized with. Because if we were doing it formally, we'd have to be profiling everybody's job role and it would take ages. Whereas the organic growth approach is, well, if it works for you, it works for you. So personas help us consider the needs of our users without getting too specific about their use cases, and allow us to investigate the depth and breadth of analytical potential at an organization without getting too bogged down in pilot project planning, which, yeah, who loves that? So one thing that I would definitely draw from this slide is that they're not just for building. Personas can also evolve over time with the product's maturity, providing new insight into teams which use them, which is also really helpful. Cool. So thanks for that explanation, Louisa, but how does this help me with enablement? In that although they're usually thought of as a very software development-y type tool, the key point of a persona to allow us to model our solutions and strategies on people we can really imagine is invaluable to plan and deliver our analytics platform or strategy. So Chris, when we were rehearsing this, you had a good anecdote about the time where you were involved in persona analysis at an organization.
Yeah, so it was actually I found my face on a bunch of personas that UltraX had developed, and it helped me to see, because I was described as this. It was in my old job role. We're going back kind of 10 or so years. I was described as a consultant, and there was a whole list of details about the fictional Chris, what his likes were, what he what kind of things he'd do with the tool and how he'd build it out. But then alongside that, there were lots of other people with different faces as well. And I think it really brought home to me, and as I was kind of then thinking about my own rollout, how different people had different needs to me. So I needed a lot of access to the kind of not necessarily formal training courses, because I was very hands-on with the tool. I was already got a high level of engagement with it. I needed access to people just to bounce ideas off, lots of kind of tips, community, things like that, versus someone else in that with a very different persona might just need more formal training courses to help them guide things out. I mean, it's a very easy way to say, well, this is kind of stating the obvious, you know. All we're saying is everyone's different. But there was also then opportunities for me to look for other Chris's in the organization, people that thought the same as me and might be able to kind of just take on exactly that same approach, and also a way to talk about people in the organization with a very easy language. Well, that person is a Joe, that person is a Louisa, or whatever names we give to those personas. It just, I find it really helped to almost give us a common language to talk about some of the challenges that each of these people might face.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about creating a common language, because sometimes when we model our users, or we think of the people who are using it, we might think of you know, the person who's always on the phone to the IT help desk, and it's like, well, don't think of them like that. You know, you're already including a kind of a level of quite mean judgment when you're thinking about them. So why don't you think of it as you know, Mary, who actually just really needs to understand what this means, because that's the way they learn, or because they don't have time to do the DIY or something like that. So yeah, cool. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. So without further ado, we are going to get on with an example. And our example is going to be set in a logistics business who have decided they need to improve their use of data to maintain their competitive edge. Even before the coronavirus struck, logistics in the UK anyway, it was a really tough business. I'm pretty sure it's tough around the world. And the board have decided that in the post-COVID world, they're going to need every edge they can get. But how can they improve data use across the business and not just people who work in the offices? So let's meet some of our business users. We have Patience, who is the Director of Business Development. She determines opportunities for business growth and is a member of the board. Thierry is a business analyst. He provides reports to the business as well as one-off investigations into particular issues. So often when I'm consulting a client, I'm often a Thierry, or I may possibly be a Lou Jane, who is a cross-functional expert focused on supply chain. She works to ensure the warehouse and transport functions are smoothly integrated. Lastly, we have Zhang Wei, who works in HR, specializing in the advice and management of warehouse staff. And we also have Rasmus, who is a shift manager in the warehouse and spends a lot of time handling staff and work changes for the shift. So, Chris, if you were going to sort of consider where to start with such a broad array of users in a product enablement or a product rollout, would you agree with our often touted data democratization approach, where we just give everybody a license and they know their data, so of course they know what they're doing, and we just let them at it?
No, I think what tends to happen is when you approach a rollout like this, you tend to focus on, you recognize that data democratization isn't necessarily going to work, because you can't just throw a creator license for Tableau or an Alteryx designer license to everyone here. And I think, you know, we recognize that very quickly, but what the alternative is that we focus solely on the likes of Thierry, the likes of Lou Jane, and those people behind these personas get a lot of attention. And those people who might then consume them, maybe someone like Patience, is also given a lot of attention, because they're seen as a good user of data. The likes of Rasmus, I think sometimes I've fallen into the trap of seeing users like Rasmus as somebody who doesn't engage well with data. They're going to be a problem on this rollout. How do we educate them to be better users of dashboards? How do we educate them to come around to our way of thinking? And we tend to use very negative language about people who don't necessarily want to engage with data because they've got that day job. And I think that creates quite a lot of friction, both in terms of rollout. You feel like you're failing to engage everybody as that happens.
Yeah, exactly. Often Thierry and Lou Jane probably get most of the attention. They've got the time to be passionate. They're probably they've probably spent their time at the Alteryx Inspire live stream over lunchtime while Rasmus was sorting out some sort of warehouse issue. So yeah, I can definitely agree with that. So from our personas, and I should add, all of our personas are stock images. We have not pinched pictures of people either at our clients or at the information lab without their knowledge to provide our personas. So here are some of our speed bumps with our users. Patience is too busy because she doesn't have time to teach herself a BI tool while she's making important business decisions about how to respond to a pandemic. And Zhang Wei isn't sure he can use either of the products in this way, or indeed any of them, so Tableau, Alteryx, Snowflake, AWS, because HR data is sensitive and he doesn't want the data to end up in the wrong hands, which is a fine concern. This is an easy thing to solve in all of these tools, but it requires a little bit of specialist help to ensure everything is set up okay, and visibility and aggregation might vary between projects. Sounds like a lot of work. He's got a day job. And lastly, we have somebody like Rasmus. So he uses a handheld terminal for his work in a warehouse, which in this case is going to be an iPad. He doesn't have access to a computer for work, much less one to design dashboards and workflows. And lastly, I don't know if anybody in the audience has ever tried to use the tooltips on a dashboard on an iPad, but the touch and hover are different. So they can all see the reasoning behind the data initiative, and that's important to emphasize. They all get it. But the way it looks at the moment doesn't necessarily look like the right way for them. And this panel is to show how sort of the democratization techniques that we've discussed may not be the panacea for everything, even though data democratization is often touted as a solution. If it creates friction, it will stop the technology adoption in its tracks. So how else can we think about this? So let's start again with some questions to our personas about how they interact with data. Here, we haven't started with questions like technical features or capabilities. We've asked user or persona-centric questions. So what is the key type of question that our users are asking of our data? Making consistent, important decisions about what's going on, patients Rasmus and Zhang Wei, and understanding why and how is Lu Jane and Thierry. Not exclusively, sometimes they will have to cross over, but this is in general. So this gives us quite a bit of starting insight about how to evaluate our potential solutions and capabilities without having to go anywhere near like a Gartner report or something like that. Our users who would benefit the most from broad spectrum tools are those who will be exploring their data for their own and others' benefit and might be answering a huge variety of questions. So Lu Jane and Thierry are analysts. The others have a somewhat narrower frame of reference in that they just need to consistently understand what's going on. These three users are also the ones who raised our initial speed bumps on our previous path. So Chris, when you're working with organizations on rollout and enablement, do you find, I mean, I appreciate it does vary a lot with different organizations, but do you find that there is a difference between when organizations start asking these questions? So is it, if people ask these questions earlier on in their rollout, is it more successful or can it afford to wait?
I think it is more successful the earlier that you try and work out these kind of questions and appreciate the differences between users is really key to helping things become successful. I think it's very easy to go a long way just considering the initial rollout to the likes of Lu Jane and Thierry and building those out without you get pigeonholed into a certain way of working and a certain rollout methodology that's very hard to backtrack from, and it's really important to get good working practices and think about the enablement for your users as you go along. And by users, I mean like engaging with the likes of a Thierry type persona to help them appreciate the solutions they're building and appreciate the differences between a patient, Erasmus and a Zhang Wei, and their needs, so that as they build things, they can educate. Trying to do that later on is a lot more difficult as they've got used to tools.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so these questions are really good to ask early on when we're considering it, even if we're just rolling out a suite of dashboards or whether or not we're rolling out an entirely new data platform. So part of our questions means that we also now have to start thinking about scope as well. So what's the scope of our solution? And our scope of our solution, we're now getting into slightly more technical questions. So here we are considering our scope questions against our two brackets of users. The numbers are the count of personas who fulfill that requirement or who have that requirement. They are allowed more than one response to a question. So if you are actually using this in the business, you might see this more as like a ranked preference system, but here we've left it as a vote just to keep it simple. So considering our scope questions against our earlier division between why and how and what, we can understand more about how these questions are being answered and therefore what we might be migrating. But it's still really hard to divine the difference between our non-analyst users who are key to our rollout and are key to our strategy, and our analysts. because you can see for their make decisions about what's going on, it's often they've got a point in every single one, but we know that this is actually going to be more spread out. So you might be thinking, Louisa, why on earth would we approach rollout and enablement planning like this anyway? Because often we do. Departments know that the imaginary person, our average Jane, doesn't actually exist, but as noted earlier, accommodating everyone will take too long. So by this time, people have probably started looking at software builders and checking out what's on the market. And of course, we always jump to costs. So they may have also started looking at what kind of licenses they provide. This approach essentially splits our users by their typical use cases. And it actually follows a path laid out for us for a lot of vendor licensing models. So for understanding why and how with Tableau, that's what we have the creator license for. And for understanding what, they're our viewers. And for people who might go in between, we have our explorers. Alteryx also do something similar, where users doing the why and how are probably creators on the Alteryx server or artisans, and they also have access to Alteryx Designer, while the users looking for consistent what decisions are key populations for Alteryx apps and macros, though mostly apps, that will be built by other people. In this case, probably built by Thierry and Lujain. So as you might imagine, following even a very common way of understanding our needs, which have been pre-thought of by the vendor, essentially, or even a bunch of vendors, may not be the best way to really evaluate what we want, because it's already trying to box in our thought process, as Chris mentioned earlier, and we're jumping too early into solutionizing. So I shouldn't really be wondering too much whether or not a user needs an Explorer license and how many of them, if I've only really been thinking about it for about 20 minutes. So Chris, do you have anything that you'd add to this slide? I should add to those in the audience, there's a reason why security isn't on here, which I'll talk about in a minute.
I was just going to say that, yeah, I think the obvious things that are missing are things like governance and security, and they probably have a big line across the bottom that covers everything. Everyone has those kind of concerns, or should do, or they have someone thinking about those concerns for them. I think that there's obviously a lot of different scopes and headlines. We've put the obvious ones that first spring to mind in here, but yeah, I think that there's a lot more we could add in here with lots of thought, but the slide would be too big.
Yeah, so one thing I will emphasize is that from here, if we considered our decisions about what's going on, we'd probably limit our scope to only providing aggregate data to most of our staff, and that our single department might get more of a look in over our business-wide or several departments, which defeats the point of our strategy. So let's consider this by persona then. Splitting it out by persona means we get a far better understanding of the spread of requirements around our business. It's easy to understand the start point where populations are approaching the strategy from, so doing more with data or better data decision making, and more importantly, where they may differ and differ widely. So take, for example, Rasmus, our shift manager. He hasn't got loads of requirements, he's got limited scope, and they tend to be asking the same question, but they're used to using a system UI or a mobile interface to view it. This means their reports are probably coming out of add-ons from other solutions, like production or shift management systems, rather than very often our default assumption as analysts that, of course, everything's coming out of Excel, right? So that add-on from the other solution might not have changed in a very long time. It might have been custom built, and because that's quite common for certain industrial solutions. So understanding where Rasmus will be coming from is very important for bringing him on our data journey, as opposed to just sort of going, well, we've built you a dashboard, why don't you like it? So our board member, meanwhile, Patience, actually has most of her requirements covered by the two analytical roles. But will Patience be building the dashboards herself, or most probably viewing things that Lujain or Thierry have built? At the moment, that doesn't matter. The flexibility for each board member will vary, and that's okay. We don't have to force a decision on how our board members prefer to interact with data when we're using personas. So onto the security item, you'll notice that from the earlier that Zhang Wei's concerns about any potential platform which revolved around security aren't included in these questions. They could be, but it's actually not that common for users to express preferences about security, which is ultimately what these are. Security is set by policy within a company to ensure compliance, not just what everyone feels like, because that is no basis for security. As such, we can actually shortlist our solutions based on the scope we have now, and then we can engage IT, legal, and compliance about security with the shortlist, because they already have enough to do. If we were asking them to evaluate 15 different solutions, security models, I wouldn't want that job, and the people I previously know who've ever worked in compliance would hate that job. So it allows us to provide that shortlist to then approach them and triage work in the right way. Chris, would you have anything to add about delivering persona analysis to a client like this?
No, I think it really helps that, as we've said, the earlier you do this, the better. And then as you roll things out, again, using conversations like, oh, that person is a patient. They might be a board member, but they might like to get real hands-on with data and like building a lot of things. And therefore, you could spot that initially and say they're not a patient. So they're going to be more a Lujain, etc. And you're able to then tailor the enablement. And obviously we're looking at the scope of questions, what they want to see, but a really key part of this is then how do we enable these people with the different solutions? What different approaches might we take to actually helping them get the most out of these things? By spotting those personas and spotting who fits in each bucket, we can then identify how we might roll things out too as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Part of we can easily tell from our sort of persona analysis with our little dot chart, I suppose, unit chart, that's what it is that our business analysts and cross-functional experts are probably going to need a different kind of training from our shift managers and our board members. And a lot of that, again, sounds really obvious, but it's always obvious until you're inviting all your shift managers in for 5 days worth of training and they're sitting there going, why am I here? So that's always important to bear in mind. So on that note, our personas, we've also added this analysis. So this is definitely not part of agile analysis, is that we can also take it to understand something about the scale and flexibility requirements, which users on their own cannot provide because they only know their own stuff. So scale and flexibility are things that we can only really answer on an organizational level when we're doing that rollout. And they can indicate different requirements for different tools. GASP, we might have to not just buy one thing that does everything. So, but also our potential requirements for change management, as Chris said, about our training, in that we see that we have 100 shift managers or so, but they haven't got a lot of requirements. So the way that we have to think about training them is focusing on scale. The way that our licensing might have to consider is that scalability. Whereas our cross-functional experts, Lee, Jane, and Thierry, they have a lot of requirements, but there aren't that many of them. So going back to your experience before where your face was on the slides, Chris, people like that, as you say, their training requirements might not be something that's necessarily very formal, but still have that requirement to be able to bounce information off others or have communities of practice, which are really important. So what would be best for this organization? I suppose here we have to think that the first thing is that dashboards maybe aren't the only answer. So while all of these users might have a use case a dashboard could answer, we shouldn't really be trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. A daily update on warehouse operations for shift managers like Erasmus might be best served by an email sent by a scheduled Alteryx workflow that is formatted nicely with the reporting tools, for example. Zhang Wei and his HR business partners, they've probably got a lot of data that they want to present back to people about performances or those diversity surveys or the employee satisfaction surveys. They probably don't want to allow the departments to compare themselves very easily, because that's the start of a lot of arguments in the tea room. But they could have simple visualizations which employ row-level security to ensure that they aren't having to construct those new reports every single year from scratch. And that way, in future, it will also allow partners to compare progress over time. And lastly, Lujane could create a dashboard to show how smoothly inbound and outbound logistic movements perform over time. But she can also show her users in the planning department, who are, just the notch above finance in people who like to look at spreadsheets, that they can easily access their data behind her analysis using tools within the Tableau server to, say, get information on a movement by movement basis if they have to analyze edge cases. So what we're saying to you here is that we can fully investigate solutions, but it's not about ditching dashboards, and it's not just about sticking with what you know. So it's accepting that sometimes, although we can get caught up in a bit of a hype cycle with features, that what's best for the organization goes back to what Chris said earlier, where we're keeping in mind what the goals are and what the value that people want are. So Chris, I know that in rehearsal you made a really good point about that common language of communication as to how we talk about users when we're doing this kind of judgment about what's best for an organization.
Yeah, so I think the when we talk about that, it's kind of, you'll have to remind me what I said because my mind's gone blank.
Good and bad.
Good.
How we describe people.
So, yes, so
yeah,
absolutely.
There you go.
So yes, it's the snobbishness around the dashboards and around things. I think we do develop quite a snobbish behaviour around the way people approach dashboards. So we use language like, that person is good because they've adopted the things that we're used to as consultants or as analysts rolling this out, and those people who aren't adopting those as fast might be considered the bad people who we need to change. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's getting rid of that snobbishness, changing the way that we talk about things, and having some empathy at the end of the day for how people might want to adopt those.
Yeah, that's really important, because often, even if we're not talking about explicitly as cartoon villains like goodies and baddies, the judgment is often implied in the words that we use. Because what's the opposite of being an innovator? If you use the new tools, you're an innovator. But if you're not, then what are you? Particularly if we've used words like that to describe people, when actually everybody's just trying to do their jobs. And if the table is the best way to do it, just give them a table. You don't have to give them a chart all the time. That's okay. So we're almost at the end of the session today, and we would like to leave time for some questions. So what's next? And particularly after so much information. First things first, try it yourself. While they're borrowed from Agile methodology, personas don't have to be a formal tool. Any Agile master here, don't at me that I've just called Agile a formal methodology, but personas can just be a sketch on a piece of paper. So my rule of thumb is that most organizations will have at least 3. They will have an executive decision maker, somebody like Patience, an analyst, probably somebody like Thierry, and a day-to-day decision maker, somebody like Xiangwei or Lujane. Not Lujane, or Rasmus, sorry. We can inform our sketches with a lot of information that's available to us already, and some of it is in unusual places. So on Tableau Server, for example, we can surface people's server usage using tools like Project Griffin, which provides a valuable repository of information as to what's being used or indeed not being used. Our everyday conversations with our peers, colleagues, and stakeholders give us a lot of information about how they do or do not use data. My shortcut sometimes when I'm at a client is what's everybody complaining about. And our organization charts show the different roles we have at an organization, which can expand our horizons as to the kind of work that actually everybody does. And lastly, our friends in IT, who are often left behind in these conversations, because hey, they just want to pour water on our fire. They maintain a catalog or a record of all the software they need to maintain. So is there any other software in the business which provides data that you might not be aware of, and does it provide it in particular ways? So this leads into the next point, which is understanding the potential of the tools that the personas have access to, and also what people are missing. So do you have to buy something new, or do you just need to educate people on how some features that they might not know about, which is also totally fine. If you're wondering where to start even further back from that, right at the beginning, visit your data team's project backlog, the to-do list. Who's asking for stuff? Is it always the same person? Is it a broad variety of people? And one thing I definitely like to emphasize, as Chris mentioned in his last comment, is put your empathy hat on. The point of having personas is that we consider our users as real people, not checklists, annoying stakeholders, or sticks in the mud. Everybody is just trying to do their best. So,
and I think to that point, it really helps to literally write out, as I've done in the past, kind of a good few paragraphs about each persona, and almost get to think of them as real people, their likes, their motivations, what's driving them, and that really helps you see them with that empathy. So yeah, doing that I think really helps.
Yeah, that's really important. It doesn't have to take long, but just giving it some thought about actually what does drive this person, because you do probably know from talking to them, and just getting it down on paper is really valuable. Cool. So now we have time. Oh, no, go on, Chris.
Oh, I was going to say that perhaps leads on to a question that Shan's asked around how long does it take to conduct an effective persona analysis?
That's a good question. Depends how long you've got, I'd say.
It does. I think it's a process that's probably never finished. I think you could knock up a very quick start to some personas around their needs just by looking, as you said, at your backlog for your project. Start thinking about you'd probably be able to almost identify those users just by sitting down and thinking for 20 minutes about the different types of people you engage with every day. That would create spend a day or so writing up the results and starting to think. But then you're going to have to go out and do a bit more work to find out about the people you're missing, and also spend time talking to those individuals that you've identified as almost like the stereotype patients or the stereotype Janway, so that you could kind of almost like an interview process to find out more about their motivations rather than you guessing. So 2 days, 3 days with a bit of dedicated time, I think it would be really easy to create something really useful. But it's, I think, as Louisa said earlier, it's something that you can continue doing then with a very light touch and developing as you go through. And a lot of this is about building out the use of personas. So once you've developed them, you're really right at the very start. If you're an analyst involved in the rollout of, say, Tableau, using this in all your conversations with your managers, with IT, introducing the idea so that it becomes part of the conversation when you're discussing the rollout and how to enable people, when you're talking to your partners. That's where the real work is, and that's not something that we can put a time on. It's just something that you do as part of your day-to-day meetings.
Yeah, like I remember one time Chris and I were on a call early in the year with a client, and we kind of did a very brief version with them. And it took maybe 45 minutes for us to go through actually just but a lot of that was about more separating them from the idea that everything is a dashboard. Like, think of this user, or we know that some of your users, because we were talking to a senior member of staff, we know some of your users aren't people in the office, and here's how we think about them differently. And it was really valuable for our client to be able to understand, okay, wait, not everything is a dashboard, or not everything is I don't necessarily have to consider the way that these people are working, or the responses that they've gotten, because sometimes you can't help the feedback that you get. People aren't necessarily trained to give feedback. That instead of thinking of it as hostile, as friction, that's something to be quelled. Instead, it's something to understand, and I think that's really important with that empathy. But yeah, it's quick to build, but it's just using them over time, and definitely checking your assumptions about the ones that you might have made about particular personas. So when I worked in the civil service, I also worked for a municipal body in the UK, and the departments had stereotypes about other departments. Because it's a big organization, it was kind of fun to do because it's quite funny. But when you're building products for them, when they're your stakeholders, you can't just sit there and go, well, you know, these guys are always, they never fill up the tea caddy in the kitchen. So I know what these guys are like. No. Remember, check your assumptions. Make sure that they're grounded in something that's real and not just stereotypes that we might have about each other. No offense to all the people in finance I may have partially disparaged during this call. So my sister is an accountant. Cool. Are there any other questions that we have?
I think there was one on organic growth again from Shan earlier. I think the question was about what kind of approaches can we learn to increase organic growth? And I think we've perhaps answered that as we've gone through, really, because using persona analysis, you can really work out which personas will really thank you for that organic growth approach, which ones will really adapt to it and grow with, or which ones might you want to take, like Rasmus in our warehouse. I don't think he's going to just like being thrown lots and lots of different trial reports and see which one he likes. He's going to he's got very limited time. He'll want to get something, he'll want feedback on it, and then know that the next week is going to be rolled out formally and how to then talk to his team members about using it. So that's really key. Treat people differently and use this to drive that organic growth where it makes sense.
Yeah, and understanding that organic growth is not just, although we've slightly caricatured it in this way, that it's not just expecting people to be passionate, because people can be passionate in different places. If we built a great thing for somebody like Rasmus, he can become that accelerator within the warehouse, where he can go, hey guys, look at this thing. Where, you know, an analyst coming down to the warehouse and going, hey guys, I built this really jazzy thing. Like, yeah, okay, fine, whatever, we don't care what you think. But somebody like Rasmus, who knows the demands and who knows what a good solution will be and who knows the constraints it has to work in. If we build a good solution, we can then use those people as our organic growth in that way. So definitely considering that there are different strategies for everyone, and the way that we can use a persona analysis actually to work out between them is really helpful.
Tim's asked how we can translate between departments, how personas translate between. I know one thing I was conscious of as we put together the slides for this was that we were talking about that Rasmus is in the warehouse, and we were almost assigning different people to different departments automatically. I think you can almost remove that warehouse role from, if you get good at this, you can almost remove that from the description and start to get much more generic in the person's needs and much more talk about the kind of things that they need, rather than focusing on they work in this particular department. You'll soon begin to see the overlaps between the different departments as you develop them on a department by department basis and be able to roll them up.
Yeah, and as you sort of understand your organization more, you'll start to understand some of those, for want of a better phrase, fault lines in between the personas. So, for example, I remember working somewhere where I was working in a change management product. We did have a persona of a certain kind of user. And this user was actually like 70% of the company because of the sort of work that they were doing. And what actually unified them together was that they often worked in shifts. They did loads of different jobs. So this was actually for a large brewery. So some of them were brewing beer, some of them were bottling it, some of them were transporting it, some of it were shifting it around the warehouse and doing all these sorts of things. But actually what unified their persona together was they often worked in shifts, and therefore their constraints on their time became a bit of a driving motivator for us to understand, okay, although this is a persona and there are different people all over the company, you know, this is a sketch of a kind of person, we ultimately worked out that the unifying thing was that lack of time, but a lack of time in a specific way.
That's really interesting, yeah.
Cool. It is now
Super.
2 o'clock. But does anybody have any other questions? Or you can always ask me and Chris on Twitter.
And thank you, Chris and Louisa. Everyone who's still joined, I have added Chris and Louisa's Twitter profiles and LinkedIn pages at the top of the chat as well. So you can always scroll up and find those if you want to connect with them on social as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. The recording for this will be sent out to everyone who's joined next day or two. And yeah, if you do have any other questions for Chris or Louisa, please reach out to them over social or send them through to events@theinformationlab or oneword.co.uk and I'll forward them through. So thank you both, Chris and Louisa, and thank you to everyone who joined. Hope you have a lovely afternoon, at least from us here in the UK, and morning or evening, depending where in the world you're joining us from.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and
Thank you,
very
everyone.
much, everybody, for joining.